My name is Jamie Leach, and I'm hosting today's podcast of Queer RelationTips, a Q&Tips. Isaac and I have done that a few times in the past around specific seasons to address kind of a Q&A type thing regarding relationships from our queer community. And so that's what we're going to be able to do today. Very excited that we're able to do so from the Brian M. Eckstein podcast stage here at the 2023 Q Christian Fellowship Conference in Washington, D.C. Really happy to be here and so thankful for this conference and everything that it's doing for people and for others. On the Whova app, you can ask questions anonymously if you would like, but otherwise, I really am hoping to be able to engage with you as a live audience. And if you have questions that you want to ask here, we can actually have a dialogue as part of the podcast. So I'll open up the floor a little bit to see if anybody wants to get started. Or if not, I can start with some of the ones that have already come in on the app. Yes. Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so I know that a lot of us, especially within queer Christian communities, deal with a lot of trauma. And my triggers are like so my partner and I have like conflicting triggers, like large displays of emotion trigger them. And not having space to fully express my feelings because I always had to like super minimize and they always had to deal with explosions, you know? And so it's just it's been, it's very complicated and very difficult for us to kind of manage that. And so just kind of wondering, how do you move through that space of having those conflicting triggers, especially because we have a lot of trauma in this community?
I appreciate that. Yeah. So having conflicting triggers within a relationship that tend to lead to trauma, and for you specifically in your relationship, one of you, your partner, has a hard time with big displays of emotion because that was part of their upbringing. And for you, it's actually feeling like you need to repress or not have a voice. That's particularly triggering. And you can see how those would be very difficult to navigate because it probably feels very much like one or the other, right? Somebody has to sort of navigate self-soothing and everything to get through a conversation. So something that I would really encourage, right? If you can work with a third party, that's always helpful within this, just because it can kind of create a little bit of that balance. But for the two of you, I think having a conversation around, we just previously did a session on this, but what you want conflict to look like in your relationship and how you're going to navigate that so that you can come up with a process. So that way, for you, right, you feel as though you have a space and a platform to be able to talk and express what it is that you're needing to have be received and to know that you're heard. But then for your partner to also know that it's not necessarily going to get too big or too out of control or kind of trigger that flight or flight response that happens so often when we're in conflict. So it's going to be a meeting one another, I think, to a space where what can expression look like and understanding look like without maybe having the triggering aspects of it. And then, what does it look like, to be able to meet one another, right, on that kind of even playing field. And I know that's a little, I know there's far more nuance to your individual relationship within that, but it's a really important thing to bring up because there is a lot of trauma and unfortunately, also some violence that a lot of times we navigate, whether it's just existing in a world that's violent toward us, family members, other previous relationships. So having a conversation about that and making sure that you kind of know what those boundaries are and how are we actually going to engage when we do have conflict can really help set the stage for when it does come up, so it doesn't feel like it's a really activating experience. Yeah. Is there any follow-up with that you're curious about or needing? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for being brave and being our first person to ask the question. I really appreciate it. Are there any other questions that people would like to ask now? Yeah.
What's your recommendation on, or where you've seen that having a family, a big family, my family, that's 95% non-affirming, and where I've been out for 3 years and they have told me, if you ever bring someone around, we're going to have to set up boundaries. And, and I'm in a newer relationship, which is very great. And, we've been open about the possibility of them never wanting to meet her. And her family is really great and wonderful. And, the possibility of meeting them is very, very likely, and being introduced to their family. But ultimately it's going to bring choices and things like that I know are going to be very hard. And eventually I'm going to, I feel more, I'm going to be a middleman where I'm going to have to decide how to keep a relationship with my family and then keep a relationship with my partner. So even with a newer relationship that's really great and stuff, it still brings a lot of what ifs and anxiety for the future. So navigating that, they don't know about her, but they know about me, but then have made, set boundaries for the future of possibly someone bringing, me possibly introducing to someone that they're going to, maybe make some boundaries and cutoffs. So.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that. I know that is got a lot of layers and complexity to it, for sure. And being in many ways, right, feeling kind of like the lone wolf within your family has to be also very difficult. Congratulations on the relationship. I do want to say that that's encouraging, but I do know that it brings a lot of different changes within it, and kind of navigating what that would look like. I think the initial thing, and without knowing all the details, so I want to be very sensitive when I'm ever answering any questions, right, that I know I'm not aware of all of the details of what's going on for you specifically, is that, with your family, they're saying, hey, if you were to ever bring somebody around, that we need to have a conversation about boundaries. I would maybe kind of lean into that actually and say, we do, and that conversation needs to go both ways. So really thinking about what it is that you need in order to be honored as a person who is a member of your family, could be a really important place to start that conversation in regards to an ask, right? So having a platform where it's not being told, right, what you can or can't do, but having more of a dialogue around how can we ultimately anchor ourselves in the point of when we're together, right? So what is the reason why we gather when we're together? It's to connect, most likely, or have fun, to form memories, that kind of thing. So how can we do that in a way that's honoring for both of us, so that I don't feel like I need to, be hiding or completely separating part of my life from those anchor points, but that also you maybe don't feel like you need to, deal with a situation that's unknown, which is often the case in these kinds of situations. And I know it can be incredibly difficult. As far as the triangle that you're talking about ultimately, which is, will I be the middle person within navigating a relationship and my family and trying to keep the peace if they're not going to be able to have a connection together? That is not an easy place to be in. And I think the really important thing over time is navigating how you would prioritize those relationships within your life, right? So initially, when the relationship is early, it may not feel as crucial because, it's not somebody that you're maybe forming a lifelong partnership with, or getting married if you want to, or whatever that winds up looking like for you. But as the relationship gets closer and closer, I think having more conversations about what that means within your relationship, and then also with your family, is really important. But creating space for that to be an ongoing dialogue can be really helpful. And I know that's easier in some families than others. So again, I'm aware that there's some nuances I'm missing. But I would just encourage you to also take the path that it will probably not be the same way forever, and that there can be progress that's made over time as well, because it can very much feel like an all or nothing sometimes when we're dealing with this particular kind of situation, where it's feeling as though if it's this way, it's going to be this way forever. And so a big part of triangles as well in general is maintaining the connection and relationship that feels honoring to you with your family and with your partner. And then continuing to, acknowledge that you would really like for them to have a relationship as well. And really figuring out kind of what the balance might look like within that. And the more that people talk about it, the more they might realize, right, that what boundaries mean might be very much assumed, right? Or it might not actually be, as violating as you might think, that kind of idea. But I think it's really good you're thinking about it right now and thinking ahead. And I'm also sorry and sad, of course, that you have to navigate it too. It's not easy. Is there anything else that kind of came up from that you're wanting to follow up on?
I think just the biggest thing, being like that middle person. I'm the type of person that's always thinking of other people's feelings too. So most importantly, the one that, would probably matter long-term would be like my partners, in the sense of keeping in mind that even though right now they might be saying, no, it's okay, we'll figure it out when that bridge crosses. But what if that bridge starts crossing and, I don't want to get to a place where it feels like I'm choosing family that doesn't support me over like a partner that does. So that's like a hard place to be in too, because it's like you want to form this relationship with your family still and keep it there. But if they're not including your partner, how do you do that? So I like understand that. So I guess my question with that is, how do you keep in mind yourself and then your partner's feelings towards it? Because initially they could be, nope, let's do this, and then start getting apprehension towards you choosing family over them. Not necessarily that's like how it looks or is, but it could look that way. So.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. Being kind of stuck within that rock and that hard place is very much a potential reality. And it's something that I think continued conversation is going to be needed around. I think really thinking about it too, also from what you were saying, when you're like thinking about others' needs first, which isn't a bad thing. It could be really helpful to think about this and spend some time really thinking about what it is that you ultimately need. As well, right? So what would I need if nothing were to change, right? What is it that I would need in order to be able to like continue to engage my family? And do I need to have some more conversations with them? In terms of asking more from them. I think so often as queer people, when we come out, if we're not fully rejected, we feel like that's good enough. And that's something that is really tough, right? I hear that all the time. And I'm not saying that it isn't something to be grateful for, where it's like, oh, well, I didn't get kicked out, so I'm very glad, right, that I'm okay, that I am happy having this, or, I'm just glad I still have a relationship with my family. Those are the good things to be thankful for. And at the same time, it's okay to lean in a little bit and kind of ask for a little bit more from the people who love you. Most often it's coming from a place of fear and not fully understanding. And so it can be starting with even just like smaller relationships, ones that you have a closer bond to, and asking if they would be willing to really engage in getting to know your partner one-on-one and having it be kind of more intentional moments, right? Over time can be a little bit less intimidating and a little less like us, them feeling. And so that is a possibility there. But I would say over time, it's really talking with your partner and saying, how do we prioritize our relationship as we grow closer in general? For some people, it does tend to work out really well, right? To kind of say, this is my primary organizing relationship. And so if I'm going to organize my relationship around this, what my partner needs and feels may prioritize the needs and the feelings of my family, right? As I may not be organizing my life around them if they're not willing to work on those bridging conversations, right? If things kind of stay in a certain rigidity. But the hope is over time that won't feel so rigid, right? But I know it's a big task and it's hard when you're thinking about the future, wanting to know how it'll all play out. Yeah, I totally get that. Thank you. Is there any other question from the audience? Cool. I'm going to pull one up from the app, and this is anonymous. So the question is, how do I maintain my sexual ethic while also dating other women? I find that I feel kind of silly when I tell people I don't plan on having sex until I'm married, because I'm already sinning in some people's eyes for being queer anyway. So what's the point, right? I think this is a really good question, a really important thing to put out there, and a pain that I think a lot of us can kind of identify with and understand. It's not easy, right, to feel as though you're being lumped into one category. I think actually in general, that can be very difficult. I mean, even as queer people, figuring out what our labels are is really important for self discovery and identity, and really getting to know ourselves and how we represent ourselves in common language with other people. But it also can be, challenging too, because the way that I experience myself as trans non-binary may be very different than how somebody else does, or, how I identify as queer may be very different. So being put into these lumped categories can be just an exhausting experience. And most definitely when it's one that feels really negative, like you're being labeled a sinner for being queer, for being gay. And so this is a very, very important example of inside out type work, not allowing the outside influences to erode the values and the internal world and the person that you are. It's a very challenging thing to do, but I think the thing about being, a queer person is it doesn't diminish you as a human being, and the fact that you have interests, ideas, values, things that make you who you are. And so making a stance around, I want to wait until I'm married to have sex does not, you're not, precluded from making that decision. And then I also think, identifying your why behind that decision can also give you greater confidence in it. Why am I doing this? Right? What about this represents my values? And realizing that that's what you're ultimately doing anyway. So that's not, it's not easy. And I feel for you, whoever asked this question. And I appreciate that you're willing to engage in, thinking about, ultimately being intentional in terms of how you want to do your life and your relationship, because I think that's what is really important about what we can do as more visible queer people, is navigating the pathway of figuring out how we can thrive, because that is very much possible. Any questions from the audience? Yes. I don't have a comment about that. Yes. That's great.
So 3 years ago, 10 years ago, when I started figuring out that I liked women, I always thought that I had to give up things when I started dating women, because I just couldn't find someone that fit that form of, or my values and morals that I wanted, of still having faith in being queer or gay, And so when I actually came out 3 years ago and started looking and literally Googling Christian gay groups, I ended up finally finding people that, I don't want to really say match, but like was able to fit like the morals and values that I was looking for in a partner. So in regards to that question, if someone's waiting till marriage, someone out there is also waiting for marriage. So you just have to wait and look a little harder, because we put ourselves in a box already if we have to put ourselves in a box. But then when you're looking for faith-based and morals and values, you put yourself in a smaller box. But there are people there. So you just have to find them. Yeah. And put yourself out there. So.
Yeah, what an encouraging word. That's absolutely true. It's really important. You're not alone is also a very important thing. And finding continued support within that, and that you still get to identify and define ultimately who you are and how you want to live your life, no matter what. It's big. Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? Anything stirring up? Yes.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
So here's my situation. I am currently engaged to my fiance, who's also a woman, and we're in the process of planning our wedding for July. And we actually have the same first name as each other. We have different nicknames, but we have the same first name. And so one aspect that we've been trying to figure out is, what do we do with our names? Because if we have the same legal name as each other, I feel like that's kind of going to be logistically difficult. Every piece of mail, every time we go through airport security, if we have kids in the future, like how many people are going to look at a record of the family and think that it's a mistake or a duplication or something like that. So like all those logistics seem, kind of difficult to navigate, but we do want to like communicate that we're one family. And so I think that like one of our solutions that we've been floating is, maybe taking each other's last names as a middle name so that we have, a slight difference or, something like that. But another aspect of this is that I think that because there isn't really a script for what we're doing, like, when we're planning a wedding, there's so many traditions and so many practices and so many symbols that we kind of have to pick and choose on every single thing, what we want to include, if we want to adapt it. Like one of the things we're considering is like how we want our wedding party to like enter the ceremony. And I have a good relationship with my parents. They're affirming of our relationship. They have a good relationship with my fiance as well. She's very much part of my family at this point. And her parents they're nice to me, but they're not excited about gay marriage. They don't agree with it. It's not to the extent of the relationship is severed. It's not to the extent of that they're not going to be there, but there's a whole slew of tensions, and, her being gay is just the cherry on top of all of that, And so when we're thinking about that, like, I would love to have both of my parents walk me down the aisle, because I don't know, I feel like it seems like less of like a transfer of property than like a joining of families, but she doesn't want that because she doesn't have that relationship with her family, But the other weird thing is that if my parents do that and hers don't, it's like a very like, it like would highlight those existing issues in like a very public way. And like everyone who's going to be there already knows that this is the situation. They already know that her parents aren't accepting, but are like trying to be civil, trying to make things work, but that it's really complicated, So I guess I'm just like wondering like what advice you have on navigating these kinds of situations when there isn't like a script to follow. Like there's a lot of freedom and creativity in that, but it's also like kind of overwhelming to have to like choose every single thing,
Yes, most definitely. Congratulations. It's exciting.
Thank you.
I know it's overwhelming, but it's also a very exciting time. And I think in general, right, the idea of preparing for a pretty massive transition, like lifelong commitment, can bring out a lot of really exciting things and a lot of shifts, but also a lot of changes. Like even how are we going to change our name? It's a big point of question, and what else is going to change? And then I actually really appreciate very much the parallel of what you're describing as to what a lot of us experience as queer folks, which is that we're kind of stepping out into a bit of a gray area where there's not the same rules as maybe what we have navigated, and really kind of figuring out how we want to color those lines in can be very liberating, like you said, and creative, but it can also be anxiety producing, especially when we're trying to figure out like how are we doing in the world? Are we okay? Are we right? So it's this balance between this external regulation and this internal regulation piece. I think what could be helpful, and this also seems to be a parallel for your relationship, is you both are navigating essentially how are we now choosing to make our relationship, right, the organizing factor of our life. And it's something that a lot of us feel in relationship in general, which is, oh, okay, like, this is a whole new thing. This is a a new entity, as it were, right? Something that I mentioned in my previous session, but also that I think about a lot is this Venn diagram concept, right? Where it's like, there's me, and then there's we, right? We becomes a whole other entity that develops when you go into a relationship. And so with things around the wedding, it could be a really good place to embrace practicing, right? Like, how is it that we want to feel confident about representing the things that are most important and most valuable to us, even if they aren't always, in alignment with what other people might expect. And that we're going to be needing to do this throughout our whole life anyway. And believe it or not, every relationship does. Even, straight relationships need to do this too, to some extent, where it's how are we going to navigate this situation? But I know it's especially nuanced within this because it feels as though there's more eyes on you. There's more of a desire, right, to project a specific way that we're doing, right? We're doing well. That can be very much a pressure that's put onto queer relationships a lot. As far as it goes with the parents, right? I think something that could be really valuable and beneficial might be to have conversation with the parents around this and just kind of saying, listen, this is, this wedding is about us. Like, it's our ceremony. It's our opportunity to make this transition in the world. And it's so important, that I walk down the aisle with my parents. I really have always wanted to do that. That's really meaningful to me. And, there's this opportunity that you have too, if you want to walk down the aisle as well, but we know that you're struggling with this, and we just want to talk to you about it because it might be a little bit awkward, but is that something that you're okay with, essentially? So just having as many conversations ahead of time, right, around that could be helpful. So that way it doesn't feel like you need to assume how it will go or assume the way that it is for them and then make decisions based off of that, but more kind of open up the door and kind of say, hey, this is how we want to do it. You do have an opportunity here. It's okay if you choose not to do it, but this might be the outcome. So I don't know if there's any follow-up from that you are curious about or that you're wanting to ask, but feel free if you do. If not, that's okay.
Thank you. I guess I hadn't really considered like asking all of the parents involved what their perspective is, but I think that could be really helpful. Also because like my parents actually like recently got divorced from each other and like pretty amicably. So like, okay. I don't think that it'll be a problem for, they've both individually told me, like, I understand the timing of this is awkward. Like, you're getting married and our marriage is ending and like everyone's going to be there. And, and I think that there's a lot to be thankful for in the terms of like, they want to support me in that and not have their stuff like, influence the day. But also I have considered that, this only happened 2 months ago and now everyone's feelings are running really high, but I'm like, oh, well, hopefully by the wedding, like it wouldn't be weird for them to be acting as a unit as my parents, but you never know like how that's going to play out. And so I do think that like, I don't know, involving them in those conversations and involving them, maybe not in the final decisions, but in the decision-making process could be really helpful, especially because like weddings are very symbolic. And it seems like every choice we make is like imbued with all of this meaning about like projecting like what our relationship is like and, joining our families and like everything is like full of meaning, but like also there's a lot of like human emotions involved in that too. So, so thank you for your reflections and your advice.
Absolutely. Thank you for offering that. Right. And I guess one other follow-up, I mean, that is a specific nuance that is an important thing that your family is navigating. A lot of change is happening and it has happened recently, I can tell. But yeah, I think talking to your parents too, and just kind of saying, hey, like, what is your anchor point, right? The anchor point in this wedding is that you're my parents. Oh, it's really not about your relationship. It's about your relationship to me. And that could be kind of helpful for them to have a mindset around too, is they're probably going to be self-conscious in some ways as well. But it's really good you've had the conversations that you already have had and that you're thinking about these things ahead of time for sure. And I hope it's really wonderful. I think it will be, but I do know it's a lot of pressure.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to take one more question from the Whova app real quick, just to make sure that I'm representing our anonymous folks. The next question is, what are 3 things that you would say a person needs to overcome before getting into a relationship, and why those things? This is tricky. 3 things. It could be very difficult to fully identify exactly what 3 things those would be for each individual person. But I would say probably one of the most important ones before getting into a relationship is really asking yourself, am I in a space where I'm willing to be influenced? Am I willing to change? Am I in a place where I'm willing to be vulnerable and to be seen, right? And those I know are very sweeping statements, but they're really very, very important in forming that we identity. If we're going into a relationship, ultimately hoping to maintain just ourself, right? Then we're going to have a me situation, and there's not really going to be much of a we, right, that gets formed, and that's going to cause problems down the road. So I think really thinking about that and understanding your reasons and what it is that you're ultimately wanting for a relationship can be really important in helping it to go well. And I just would say, I think one of the biggest things prior to relationship with other people is relationship to ourselves. It can be, a painful thing to ask, but the question is, do I really like myself? And do I love myself? Right? Both things are very, very important, because I am going to have a very hard time being liked and loved by another person if I'm not liking and loving myself first. And so there might be some work around that, either through community, relationship, through therapy. That would be really beneficial. But the other piece about that is realizing that no matter what, no matter who you're in relationship with, you're always with you, right? So that is a pretty crucial thing to make sure that you feel pretty solid in. And I'm not saying, I think what's really important is that there's no perfection, like there's no arrival that happens in terms of preparing for a relationship, in terms of I checked these boxes and so now I'm ready to go. I do think that there can be things that we do choose and that we educate ourselves on, in terms of, we can learn all kinds of things around the meaning of relationship, what kind of relationship we want to have. I think actually as queer people, we're really fortunate to have the different labels and things that we do have access to, because there can be a lot more self-understanding that we're invited into that people may not always have outside of this. But, I think the important thing is realizing, okay, do I feel ready and confident in who I am, but in who I am enough that I also feel like I can be myself and be influenced, right? That I can contribute to this we concept fully. I think that would be really important. So not quite 3 things, but a few really important things. And I guess the other piece too is, along with that, is really making sure that you know what your values are. I think that's probably one of the biggest forging things within relationship. Alignment and values will help to keep a relationship going through so many things, right? And misalignment and values is typically very difficult to overcome, because it's such a core part of who we are, right? I'm not saying impossible, but difficult. So knowing those things about yourself can be very important, and also give you the permission to then also be able to kind of know when a relationship is right for you, or if you're right for a relationship, to progress in the way that you want it to. Any questions from people who are currently present as we're going? Cool. I'll take another question then from the app. Let me just open it up. Okay. As my girlfriend and I are working on our relationship with God and strengthening our faith, I want to know, how can I best support her during times of doubt? One example is sometimes that she's afraid of being gay isn't necessarily right or accepted. I know that this is a really big one, And again, is going to have a lot of nuances that I'm not privy to that I would want to be sensitive around and in answering this really, really well. But I would say the biggest thing within a relationship that we can offer is we can offer security, we can offer acceptance, and we can offer consistency. So consistency is huge within relationship. It's realizing that your girlfriend's relationship with God is something that will impact you and influence you, but isn't actually up to you, right? It's a separate relationship. The relationship that the two of you have together with God can be something that you talk about and that you directly influence, right? How would we like to pursue God together would be a question that might be helpful to ask. But the consistency piece and the acceptance piece and just saying, hey, I understand your doubt, but I'm also gonna, be here as you navigate that. I'm not gonna try to solve that for you too quickly. What support do you need from me as you're processing through this? Is there anything that we need to pursue together? Mentorship, right? An outside perspective, a small group, something along those lines that would be beneficial. And I think the biggest thing within this is it's realizing that the deeper work here, right, is coming from having to shed, right, a lot of unfortunate kind of fear-based language that has been placed, right? Your girlfriend's relationship, possibly your relationship, a lot of our relationships with Jesus are first introduced through a lens of fear. Whether it be, right, fear that I'm, going to lie and do something bad and go to hell, or like, right, as for us, it can be incredibly painful because it's fear that how I am and who I am will be eternally unaccepted, right? That is really difficult and very core stuff to really navigate through. And so intellectualizing it and kind of talking through it with your girlfriend is probably not going to resolve that. It's going to have to come from a pretty core place of healing in her own relationship with God. But I think having a relationship that is consistent, loving, affirming, accepting is a really amazing platform to be able to navigate those doubts so that she's not alone. Any other questions from the audience? I know it's a lot of pressure. I really appreciate the ones that y'all have asked so far. Thank you so much for your engagement. Cool. I'll go back to the app. Do you have any tips on opening up and being vulnerable with people, even when you're uncomfortable doing so? I feel like I'm so closed off from people, and part of it is from my coming out and feeling like I had to hide parts of myself, but I'm trying to move past that so that I can have healthy, open relationships in the future. Yes. Thank you for all the questions, but I really appreciate this question too. I think it's a really important part of the process of after coming out is really figuring out how do we create alignment within the realm of the parts of ourselves that we had to hide in order to, stay in the closet, and the effects that may have had on our internal world and the way that we engage with other people. And that can result in a lot of different things. And so I would say probably the most important thing within this is an idea of kind of concentric circles. When it comes to community, I think that's a helpful and healthy platform for us to have as human beings in general, is who is our inner circle? Who are the people that we ultimately feel a certain amount of reciprocity with and safety with in giving and receiving? And I would say the inner circle concept is really, really important, because these are the people who we feel are ultimately, right, honest in their reflection of us to ourselves. The mirroring factor that happens there, and that there's a baseline of acceptance and, right, honesty and presence within that. Typically an inner circle, like the most inner circle, isn't going to be more than 1 to 3 people for most of us, just because of the amount of energy that does actually tend to take. That's not going to be, it's not a rule, but I would just say it's like an expectation setting standpoint. that if you can cultivate relationship with like 1 to 3 people that you feel like you can be your absolute most vulnerable with and your most transparent with, that is actually going to have ripple effects as well. And of course, will help you to navigate the other boundaries that you may want to have as those circles kind of move out in the other relationships that you navigate. So it's very possible to remove the mask and to feel transparent in many ways, but that you also are aware of the spaces and the people who you feel like you can actually be vulnerable with, which is typically an offering, right? Of like, this is something that you could really, hurt me with, right? That kind of idea really helps us to stay sane, but it also helps it to feel a lot less overwhelming in the sense that, as we're kind of navigating the world and figuring things out, it can help us to kind of organize who we're doing that with so that we stay grounded within ourselves. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Do you have any tips on when one person in the relationship is open, like out in their journey, and the other is more DL or like not out with everyone, navigating that relationship? Does that make sense? Does that?
Absolutely. Oh, for sure. Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. And it is very much a common experience. So I appreciate you bringing that up in terms of different timelines and different processes within, the pathway of coming out and navigating all of the different layers that come with that for each person. I think what can be very important within that is making sure that there's an ongoing platform for check-in and conversation within that. So acknowledging this is part of our relationship right now, right? There's a sense of openness and kind of a transparency that one person has and the other person doesn't. But how are we needing this to change if we do, right? And making that a very clear point of checking in. And what are the areas that we can accept or tolerate, right, through a specific timeline is a very, very important thing. So I think where people get really stuck in this particular area is if they're not really clear about that kind of later on, it can lead to a lot of pain and resentment, right? Because if the person who maybe hasn't come out much plans really never to, or really minimally or very like sparingly come out, generally speaking, that might be very difficult if the other person is just sort of expecting a progression to happen, right? And so that can be triggering too, because it can also create a dynamic as well where the other person feels as though they're needing to closet on a regular basis. And so really figuring out kind of those individual needs is pretty important from the beginning. If it's already a relationship where that has been the dynamic for a long time, it might be an important thing to kind of say, hey, we have to level set here, right? What is it that we're needing in order to really function within our relationship and to feel really good about our relationship and ourselves within the relationship? And so how can we kind of give and take a little bit on that front is a very important piece. I would say, the other piece about it, as far as coming out goes, is there's room for having conversation about that in terms of really what is most important. Similar to the internal circle kind of world and things like that, there's a lot of people who are just naturally much more private, right? So that's a very tightrope walk because they might just be private people. And so it's a difficult thing because we don't want to necessarily say, well, suppress yourself and don't come out. But also, like, is it pushing beyond the threshold of that person to come out to a lot of people or a lot of circumstances or situations? It gets very specific, I think, and individualized. But I do think having really open conversation about it and expectation setting can go a really long way within that. Is there any follow-up to that you're curious about or that's coming up? No, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Any other questions? Cool. Okay, so we'll go back to the app here. My partner and I are discussing having kids, but both of our families have been abusive and not affirming in the past. I'm sorry. We're trying to figure out how to set boundaries around our parents' interactions with our potential future kiddos and hashing out how our parents interact with them. I don't really know how to make this happen when I can barely have any conflict at all with my family and barely ever speak to them. And her mother was a Trump supporter, so there's that. I don't feel comfortable with my children being around people who voted against my family's rights, and my rigidity there is really upsetting to my partner. Help. Oh, fair enough. Yeah, that is really a challenging situation. And also it's really great. I mean, number one, it's really great that that the two of you are talking about this ahead of time again. I think it's really amazing how much the tides have changed in regards to proactivity in a relational conversation. That makes me very happy as a therapist and a person who really wants relationships to thrive. So I do want to say that. But I also know that this is difficult. So I think the really crucial piece around this is probably trying to think through what the end goal is in regards to what you actually want your interactions to be like with your family members, and recognizing that. And of course, I don't know, again, the specifics here, but it's not uncommon anyway in abusive families that, boundaries are not very well respected. And so it's very likely that you and your partner are going to have boundaries and then set them again and again and again. And so that's probably a thing that you're going to need to be prepared for and really figuring that out. But I would start more from the lens of what is it that you want to gain as opposed to what it is you want to prevent, just because that can feel a little bit more inviting and a little less overwhelming, right? So I want to gain the fact that my kids have a relationship with my mom because in certain settings, she's really lovely, or I really, want them to experience what it's like, when she's really nurturing or, funny or doing something that she's, really good at, that kind of idea. It's really thinking about what is it that you're wanting your kids to ultimately have, and trying to create situations for that to occur. I would absolutely, say that, that it's an important thing to, talk about that framework, especially when it comes to the political differences, because that is really painful and really, really hard when you have, family members or, extended family that, is really taking different stances and actively making choices that might feel like very much against you. And from that lens, I would say, it's asking maybe your partner what it is that they still love, appreciate, and admire about their family outside of that, right? So trying to see the whole picture. I guess an example of this might be, I'm going to put the pebble down in order to see the ocean, right? The pebble being this political thing, which is huge, right? I'm not trying to minimize it. At the same time, I'm going to put that down. I'm going to try to see the ocean because this is my partner's family. They raised them, right? They made a lot of mistakes, clearly. And there's a lot of hard things, but there's a reason why, right? My partner still wants to be in relationship with them. Why is that, right? And naming those things for both you and your partner can be very helpful. And then saying, hey, how would we then want those things to be translated to our kids? And what are the things that we're absolutely not going to do? Like, we really might not have our family be, babysitters, or there may not be extended periods of time when we see them, or we may need to, go to a public setting in order to have, positive memory setting. There's a lot of things that you can do, but realizing that you're more in the driver's seat than you realize, and that, having connection with somebody doesn't mean that you approve of every belief that they have either. both ways, right? So that's the challenging piece, is it's realizing I'm not approving of the fact that, you know, these are the political values that you stand for. And, you know, this is what I'm really hoping my kids will still get exposure to because of who you are as a whole person. So it's not easy. That one's not easy at all. But I think being united with your partner is going to be the most important thing regardless. And then how do we navigate that together with our kids if they were exposed to certain things and belief systems, you know, that are different, right? So if my family says something really transphobic, how do we process that with our kids after the fact, right? And how do we do that during different developmental stages of our kids' lives too? Make sure that they know where we stand and what we believe in. Are there any questions popping up here in person? Or I'll keep going down the list. I know we only have a few minutes left. Yeah, go ahead.
I have one more.
Great. Thank you.
How do you navigate, dang it, how do you navigate the emotional thought process as you're dating someone and you don't know if you really like them, but they really like you? And you don't want to like play with someone's emotions.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Do you have any advice surrounding that? Is that just more or less just having that conversation and keeping it open in the air? Or is it just like, because yeah.
Yeah, oh, that makes sense. For sure. So if you're dating somebody and they're showing much more interest, right? And then you're kind of not totally certain yourself, but you're also you're not certain, meaning you're not like wanting to totally close the door, but you don't want to keep it open and make them like give them false hope kind of idea, right? Is that kind of an accurate thing? Okay. Yes, I know that is actually also like more common than I think people realize too, right? That happens a lot. And I think can be grounds for really important conversation and kind of richness within that. I think having a conversation that feels less like it's an all or nothing can be good too, where it's like, hey, I'm still not totally sure, right? And I want to temper expectations along this, but it's not because I'm evaluating like you know what I mean? Like as a pass or fail type situation. It's because I'm really trying to gauge and kind of internally wonder and be curious about what it is I'm experiencing with you, because I'm still curious about whether or not this could work, but I'm not totally sure. But what I do know, right, is I'm still really valuing, right, you as a person, getting to know you. And I think we just need to make sure we're having pretty consistent check-ins on what we're doing and what we mean to each other. I think if you're sensing or getting the situation that the other person isn't capable, if that makes sense, of like kind of walking that line, because that is difficult and can be emotionally trying, right? Then I think it would be an important thing to just kind of say, hey, like, I really want to be protective and make sure that this doesn't cause any kind of emotional harm to you. And because I'm not certain, right, I don't think we should pursue this from a romantic lens. You know, can we still be friends? That kind of idea. And then, you know, something emerges down the road, it does, but we can't, you know, kind of navigate that because it's going to take both people. But I also think there is a lot of room and really important to be able to hang in there when we're not, you know, fully certain. A lot of times, for sure, relationships in general, because of our culture, right, are so highly romanticized that when we don't have that initial like, you know, like excitement and new relationship energy and overwhelm, we can kind of start to wonder, like, is this okay? But then there's still a part of us that's being pulled or like really feeling, you know, curious. And so leaning into that and kind of wondering about it, because sometimes long-term relationships really have a much more peaceful kind of space between them. It's not the highs and the lows, right, that we see in movies or that we expect from romance, because that's a different kind of love, right? Different plane of love. And so it's okay to kind of not, you know, totally discard it and to give it some space and time. I think that's really wise, actually. Any other follow-ups from that? Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. I really appreciate it. I know that we're kind of coming to a close now and running out of time. These were wonderful questions, and as best I can, I will do my best to answer the other questions that were in the app, either directly, right? Probably directly through the app. Just because that will be helpful, because I don't want to leave anybody hanging. But for the purpose of the conference and everything, I probably do need to wrap up, but it really means a lot. And I so appreciate all of you being here and contributing and asking your questions and, being part of this podcast, and also just what you are doing in the world and how you're navigating and showing up. It makes such a difference. So it's a joy to be in the room with you. It's a joy to be at this conference with you. And I hope that you all have a really wonderful rest of your time. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you both for being amazing interpreters. I so appreciate it. Thank you.